Bind again. Welcome to Noongom, where we explore what it means to be Indigenous today in the nation's capital on traditional Algonquin territory. When talking about Indigenous peoples, we often hear words like colonization and reconciliation. But what do these terms mean? How did we go from an entire landmass being utilized by Indigenous peoples to just small parts of land called reserves today? What's the real history of this territory? And where did the relationship go wrong?
Let's hit the town.
In 1491, Pope Alexander would make a statement called the Doctrine of Discovery. This would begin the so-called discovery of the Americas. That was over 500 years ago. However, Indigenous people still feel the impact today. Later on, papal bulls, Terra Nullius, and here in Canada, the Royal Proclamation would contribute to that impact. The Dominion of Canada was formed. However, the Canada we now see was not handed over or won in a war, as some people think. The British Crown said that the only way for Canada to become a country would be to make treaties with the original inhabitants. And therefore, numbered treaties began. Many were signed very controversially. However, these are still considered very special and sacred agreements that some say have yet to be honored. As Canada expanded its borders, legislation would pass to continue to oppress Indigenous peoples, such as the creation of the Indian Act, forced relocation of communities, creation of reserves, residential schools, the 60s and millennial scoop, and enfranchisement, to name a few. In short, a lot of pain and trauma continue to hurt Indigenous people. However, we need all Canadians in order to bring reconciliation to this land. We need allies. So, what are Indigenous people looking for in an ally anyways? What are you looking for in an ally?
In an ally? Mainly empathy, I guess, because if an ally is someone that doesn't understand you or doesn't understand where you're coming from, it's going to be really hard to relate to you and relate to what you're trying to do, express, or achieve.
To take my side when a non-Indigenous person is being discriminatory towards me.
Somebody that's willing to pitch in and somebody that cares about like your neighborhood. So in other words, our neighborhood would be Turtle Island. So somebody that actually cares about our home.
To listen with open mind and open heart, to kind of to understand the struggles that Indigenous people go through on a day-to-day basis.
It's kind of like they're already up for the cause. I don't have to explain anything. I don't have to like tell them why I'm upset or why I'm mad. They just kind of get it and they listen, and then they will listen to me and do what I need them to do instead of speaking over me or doing what they think is right for us or for me.
Somebody that you should be able to sit down and chew the fat with, somebody that you should be able to break bread with, or in our case, scone or bannock.
My name is Ed Bianchi. I'm the program manager for Kairos.
So thanks so much for meeting with me today. Can you kind of help me understand how you came into this role and what your role here at Kairos is?
Okay, well at Kairos right now I'm the program manager, and so I'm responsible for about 8 staff who work on different areas, human rights and ecological justice, and Indigenous rights. Before I was program manager, I was the Indigenous rights program coordinator for Kairos. And before that, I was the national coordinator of the Aboriginal Rights Coalition. So I've been doing this kind of work for about close to 30 years now.
What really intrigued you to get involved in Indigenous rights?
Okay, well that's a good story. I was a university student at York University pursuing my second master's degree. But I was in a film program, and they asked us to do a documentary, to make a documentary. So one of my friends suggested I do a documentary on the First Nations community in Canada. But it wasn't until I started working with a First Nation in Northern Alberta on that documentary that I was introduced to all the issues facing Indigenous peoples in Canada. So a friend of mine, a couple of friends of mine started a support group for this First Nation, and it just, one thing led to another, and I just became more and more involved. What I realized back then is that even though I had all this education, I didn't know anything about the challenges that were facing this First Nations community in Canada. And as I learned more about their situation, I learned that theirs wasn't unique, that there were First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples across the country who were facing the same kind of challenges, who were facing poverty, who were facing high levels of unemployment, who were facing like substandard living conditions. This was not unique to the community that I was working with. And so I started to educate myself about why that is the way it was. And it was through that process of education that I started to understand the historical factors that had resulted in this situation, and also the ongoing societal factors that have maintained and perpetuated the system. So it was a huge eye-opener for me, and what I found most fascinating was that even though I had had all that education, I'd never learned about this. And I felt that it was, important that my fellow citizens, my fellow settlers, learned this story, because it was so important to addressing the injustices that were taking place.
Can you tell me a little bit about the blanket exercise and some other tools you have that can help bring people to this awareness?
So when I was, I'll back up a little bit. When I was part of that support group, one of the things we used to do was just produce information, educational information, to help people understand the story of that community. And of course, right away, we were faced with all the stereotypes and all the racist and backlash, okay? Because we got all the stereotypes about First Nations people because they just didn't understand the history. So after the report of the Royal Commission was released in 1996, our Indigenous Rights Circle felt it was important to have a teaching tool that would help people understand what the report was all about, because they were afraid that A, no one would read it because it was so long, and that B, it would get put up on the shelf and forgotten and ignored. And that ended up being very prescient, because that's exactly what happened. It got put up on the shelf and ignored. And so we created this tool called the blanket exercise, which essentially tried to help people understand what the Royal Commission was trying to say in an exercise that is a participatory experiential exercise, where you got to involve your whole body in the learning experience along the methodology, the teachings of people like Pablo Freire. And it started off as this humble little workshop, but it was effective right off the bat, because it enabled people to sort of like at least get an inkling of what this history is all about, where Indigenous peoples are in that history, and most importantly, how that history has been suppressed over all these years. So the reaction we get when people do the blanket exercise is usually like, why didn't anyone teach me about this? Or why didn't I know anything about this? And that's not a reaction we get only from non-Indigenous people, we get it from Indigenous peoples as well. So it's an exercise that sort of like helps to make people aware of the different things that have happened historically that have brought us to where we are today. And I think it's important, you know, the Royal Commission called for a new relationship, one based on mutual respect and sharing, and which honors the treaties. And they said that education was key to that new relationship. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has echoed that. because they have a whole section called Reconciliation Through Education. And what they stress is that not only do we have to learn things as a society, but we also have to unlearn things. So a lot of that discrimination, a lot of those stereotypes, a lot of that racism that we encountered back when we had that support group, I mean, those are the result of things that people have learned that aren't true. And so we need to unlearn that stuff.
So over the past 40 years, what have you seen in the change of people's understanding, mainstream Canadian people? Have you seen a change in their understanding of these issues?
Absolutely. I think that as activists and allies, one of the things we're not good at is celebrating our accomplishments and recognizing, you know, where we've actually succeeded in making a difference. And I think that if you were to sort of, you know, transport yourself back 30 years, you would see a different attitude towards First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I mean, not that you know, there's still a whole lot of work to be done, but I think that what we see now is that all that work that all those people have done over all that time on education is starting to make a difference. You know, I think about when the Red Cross issued that international appeal about Attawapiskat because they said the housing wasn't good enough and the people weren't going to be able to survive the winter. You know, the government's response was standard in terms of trying to blame the people in the community and trying to insinuate or imply that the money that was given to the community or provided to the community as part of the Indian Act programs and services was somehow being misspent or wasted. And you know, I think 30 years ago the public response would have been different. This time the public didn't accept that as a response. They wanted to know, you know, in fact, why the situation in that community was the way it was, and what, you know, was the plan for changing that situation. So, you know, there has been, you know, some impact. All that education work that has been done over all the years, I think, is starting to make a difference.
Awesome. That's really encouraging to hear. So I guess for my last question, what does being a good ally mean to you?
Well, okay, and I'll bring it back to that first experience I had, because I grew up, you know, my parents immigrated from Europe. I was first generation Canadian, but I benefited from this society. I lived a privileged life, you know. I just said I went, you know, I was on my second graduate degree, so obviously, you know, that puts me in a privileged position. But it wasn't until I started learning about that community and its challenges that I understood that those privileges came at the expense of someone else. And the resources that my family was able to benefit from came at the expense of somebody else's lifestyle and standard of living. And it was what started me to what helped start me to understand that the society we live in is unfair and unjust, and that it's an oppressive society. And part of being a good ally is understanding that, and understanding where you fit in that society. And part of being a good ally is understanding that when you're working with Indigenous peoples, you're working to try and change that structure. So it's a joint process of liberation, and that means, you know, being able to understand that the work that you're doing together is all aimed at trying to change that structure, while understanding that the people you're allied with have a different experience, and that the impact on them is different than it is on you. And I think it's important to always keep that in mind, and to understand too that just because you come from this privileged place, it doesn't mean you have all the answers, so that you know what's best. And in fact, it's much more important to sort of like listen and learn rather than, you know, anything else.
Awesome. I really appreciate those very honest and truthful answers. So thanks so much for meeting with me today, and wish you all success in your future work.
Thank you very much, Gabby.
Big wedge.
What we need to do is, you know, not just explore the differences, but explore what makes us better people, what makes unity, what makes us work together, what makes us grow together, what makes us all, you know, for the betterment of all.
Respect is a really huge thing for that, and to respect someone is to know someone, and to know someone you have to live with them from the beginning to the end, or like you have to know a bit of their journey, I guess you'd say. So you got to know where they're coming from, they got to know where you're coming from, and you both have to know where you're going. I guess the easiest way to say that.
So I think that the most important thing is that they have empathy towards where you're coming from, what you're doing, and what you're trying to achieve.
Myself, I was raised by non-Native people. I was in a foster home, and for me, I think of all the great non-Native people, the non-Indigenous people that helped me in my life, those ones that took me tobogganing when I was a kid, that took me out of the foster home, that showed me what a good life was, a good life of family, a good life of community, and a good life of what makes this nation a good nation, you know? So that's what I look for in an ally.
Thanks so much for meeting with me today. I've talked to Ed already, and can you tell me a little bit about your role here at Kairos?
I work in the Indigenous Rights Program. I've been with Kairos for 4 years, and the program focuses on Indigenous rights in Canada.
So what initiated your interest to start working in this program?
I think that for anybody growing up in Canada, you kind of know that things aren't right at a sort of gut level, but since you don't really learn in school the ways to unpack that, I think it just sort of hangs there as a question. And then so as I got older and started to learn more and started to look into things more, and I spent some time living in Northwestern Ontario in Sioux Lookout, doing similar work but at a community level for the Sioux Lookout Anti-Racism Committee. I had some really good mentors there, including Garnet Anishnaabemowin, who's a survivor, and I think it really opened my eyes because even though all those issues are present everywhere in Canada, in some places it is much more in your face. Like the racism is just much more present on a day-to-day kind of level, and so I really just, when I moved to Ottawa, I really wanted to continue with the work, and so I sought out Kairos because the focus really is about educating settlers about the history and about the contemporary situation. And I think that education is key. It's really the key to how we're going to solve this issue. And without education, people react from that place of racism and stereotypes. And to unpack that, people need to know the real history. And so the work that was being done at Kairos really resonated with me.
Can you help explain the definition of that term, settler or settler ally?
Sure. So settler is people that came from away from anywhere in the world, but who aren't the original peoples of the land. Settler ally are people who I think ally, part of that term is relationships. So as an ally, you're working with Indigenous peoples, and you're in a support role. Like you're not taking the lead necessarily, but you're supporting, and you're those relationships are key. Like that's where the accountability comes in. The TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, had a very specific mandate, but as an ally organization, we were able to go beyond that a bit and include other voices that maybe weren't weren't part of that mandate. So intergenerational survivors, youth.
So as an ally, you've had to come into different communities and get to know the environment and the atmosphere and the different personalities. So what would be some recommendations you could give to people that are just starting to understand how they could be allied?
And I'm early in this work as well. But I think it's good to have a solid knowledge of who you are and where you fit. And part of that is being willing to laugh at yourself, being willing to make mistakes, even though you want to try as much as possible to have knowledge about the protocols and to have knowledge about the space that you're entering and how that context works. You also have to be kind to yourself and know that you are going to make mistakes, and just be willing to acknowledge those and to apologize for your mistakes. One thing I've found is that people are really willing to teach you if you approach them in a respectful way and ask those questions, and also to be aware of all of the trauma. Like it's been generations of damage that we've done as settler society in Canada. And so there are a lot of very hurt people for very good reasons, and so to not take it personally, you know, and to try to understand where somebody's coming from. Like if it might not be about you, it might be about other experiences they've had with settlers, or so yeah.
Often settlers may feel guilty. How would you help people to understand, to not feel guilty, and encourage them to be active?
Like, I think it's a normal reaction, but it's important to move beyond that, because it's not an emotion that helps you to take action. Like, you can get really stuck in those feelings of guilt, and and then it becomes all about yourself too. And so you really need to transform those feelings into things that allow you to take action and that allow you to take positive steps forward.
So over your short time with Kairos, and you said, you know, you're just in the beginning phases, what are some positive changes you've seen in Canadians or amongst your fellow peers?
There is a growing awareness that's happening. I think for people that have been in this work for decades, it probably feels very, very slow. But I experienced an amazing period of time early on in my work here. The winter that everyone danced, the Idle No More, and the hunger strike that Chief Teresa Spence undertook. That I really saw that have a huge impact across the country.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was a wake-up call for people. Slowly there's more openness to hearing the truth. So yeah, I haven't been in the work for that long, so I don't have that long view of things, but I have, even in the period that I've you know, 6-7 years, like I've seen these amazing transformative moments take place, and they really give me a lot of hope. Yeah.
That's awesome. So for my last question, what are some of your hopes for a new relationship and for reconciliation across Canada?
Yeah, I mentioned the education piece, and I do think that that's a really key first step, but then there's what comes next, right? Because knowing some of the history is only the very, very beginning. There needs to be restitution. There needs to be, we need to work together to repair the wrong. If we can appreciate that as people living here together, then it opens up so many new possibilities, because all of that knowledge and richness that Indigenous peoples have to offer is this huge opportunity that we've never really tapped into as a society, and I think it contains solutions to some of the problems that we're really struggling with now, some of the environmental problems, but social problems as well. I hope we're moving in that direction, and that's where I hope we'll go.
Reba, Chai Hai, thanks so much for taking the time with me today.
Thanks.
We are now in a new era, just after the release of the final report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. All Canadians, including the Canadian government, now have a chance to be good allies and to rebuild the relationship with Indigenous peoples.